Welcome to Sounds of Resistance channel. The seventh month of the war between Ukraine and Russia passed with heavy defeats and losses of the Russian army. The loss of the Russians was so great and irreversible that the Kremlin was deeply shaken and Putin became desperate and started to take risky moves to end his own regime. Russian leader Vladimir Putin could not solve the military problems in his army. On the contrary, he was causing bigger problems. In Russia, the daily news of deaths from the front could no longer be concealed by the Kremlin. The news of the missing included not only Russian soldiers without ranks, but also Russian senior commanders. The news of the death of the Russian generals, which shook the agenda, had already put the Russian army into a period of collapse. As a result of the defeats of the Putin army in Ukraine, close to 50% of the commanders of the Russian army were replaced by Putin, and thousands of Russian high-ranking military personnel were lost in Ukraine. More than 100 of these casualties in the Russian army are in the rank of colonel and above, and at least 12 of them are high-ranking Russian generals. After a series of successful operations this week, Ukrainian fighters have begun to purge one of Putin's key generals. 550 Russian soldiers, including commanders and generals, were eliminated in a single attack as Ukraine's heroic Himars artillery destroyed one of the main Russian headquarters in Luhansk. Ukrainian warriors, as a result of this legendary drone operation, the Russian army is still trying to determine the net losses, but among the clear reports that a general was eliminated. We will give very striking details of the attack in which this legendary dawn operation of the Ukrainian army eliminated one of Putin's key generals in Luhansk and a total of more than 550 Russians, including hundreds of Kadyrov's soldiers. The Russians have lost 60,000 soldiers on the Ukrainian front so far. In the first days of the losses in the Russian army, Russian leader Vladimir Putin tried to hide the news of these disappearances from the local people by hegemonying the Russian media channels. Putin tried to paint a positive picture for his people that the war was going in favor of Russia. However, in time, the losses in the Russian army could not be prevented and reached serious figures. Day by day, even Russian media channels showed the courage to acknowledge the losses in Ukraine and express that Russia was damaged by the war. Another news has been added to the news of the deaths and injuries of top Russian generals, which Putin tried to hide but failed to do. Adding another legendary feat to its advance in Luhansk, the Ukrainian armed forces blew up the main Russian headquarters in the Svatove region with a dawn operation by Himars artillery. The consequences of the attack were record-breaking. It was reported that Major General Oleg Tsokov, commander of the 144th Motor Rifle Division of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation, was seriously injured. Sergei Haidai, military chief of the Luhansk region of Ukraine, reported that 250 Russian soldiers were killed and more than 300 were injured. It was also reported that many commanders and Kadyrov's Chechen soldiers were present at the main headquarters in Luhansk. Vladimir Putin gave direct orders to generals in the Russian army due to the unqualifiedness of Defense Minister Shoigu, and Major General Oleg Tsokov, stationed in the Luhansk region, was one of the Putin's key men. Tsokov headquarters, which the Ukrainian armed forces came under fire with Himars long-range missiles, surrendered to the fires. After the fire, which was put out after a long struggle, one of the main headquarters of Russia in the region was completely destroyed by Himars, and more than 550 Russians, including Major General Oleg Tsokov, were eliminated. This could be the biggest loss the Ukrainians have inflicted on the Russian army in a single attack. This news, which fell like a bomb on the agenda, immediately mobilized the Kremlin. The Moscow administration accelerated its efforts to prevent the loss of its top generals one by one, rather than the loss of soldiers in its army. Since the Russian administration thought that the loss of high-ranking military officials would seriously affect the war, it began to withdraw the Russian generals from the front for a certain period of time from critical points. The training period for a Russian army general is about 25 years, and the cost is quite high. According to the reports of the Ukrainian armed forces, 12 Russian generals who were stationed in critical areas were killed in May alone. The disappearance of the Russian generals who led very important operations in the Ukrainian war from the army greatly reduces the faith of both the Russian army soldiers and the Russian people in the war. For these reasons, many of the Russian soldiers do not even want to fight anymore. Some of the Russian soldiers who do not want to fight surrender to the Ukrainian armed forces, while others commit suicide with their own weapons. Suicide cases with the Russian army are too numerous to ignore. There is already a communication breakdown and many rebellions within the Russian army. Most of the military personnel, including the top officers in the Russian army, are experiencing serious problems. Russian soldiers could not think positively about the course of the war in any way. It is known that in the Russian army, the commanders are in constant argument with the soldiers, and even the guns are talking in these discussions. In addition to the news of suicide in the Russian army, the Russian commanders tortured their soldiers and left them to die under very difficult conditions. The Russian army, unable to save itself from the internal conflicts, complains about the lack of weapons and bad conditions. Most Russian senior military officers define Russia as the most damaging side of the Ukraine-Russia war. High-level members of the Russian army, drawing attention to the news of death of Russian generals, expressed their reactions to Putin's invasion policy by expressing that their colleagues died on the Ukrainian fronts for nothing. The Russian army is trying to recover as a result of missile attacks by Ukrainian Himars troops at Pskov headquarters. Targeting innocent civilians, the Russian army is attempting to take the pain of military losses from Ukrainian citizens again. Russian troops carried out many bomb attacks on civilian settlements around this region. No local people were killed or injured as a result of the harassment bomb attacks carried out by Russia without a specific target. After a certain time, the Russian army began to use its combat equipment only for self-defense while retreating. Within a period of about 2 months, Russia came to this position. At the beginning of the war, the Russian army, which dominated many Ukrainian regions, including the capital Kiev, now leaves its weapons and flees without looking back when it sees the Ukrainian soldiers. This method of escape, which Russian leaders Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin call cautious withdrawal, has long been the maintained military strategy of the Russian army. Apart from the escape plan of the Russian administration, there's another interesting war tactic. In the regions of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia, where the Russian army suffered heavy losses, the Moscow administration took an interesting decision. The Kremlin administration and Russian leader Putin, who failed to establish superiority in these regions with military force, foresaw a so-called referendum in these regions. Reactions abounded to this decision. Especially exposed to the arrows of Western countries, Putin and his administration have not yet made the referendum decision, because the Ukrainian armed forces are still in a dominant position against the Russians in the aforementioned regions. While the revolts against Vladimir Putin, who dragged Russia towards the abyss, grew like an avalanche, the death of Russian generals one by one greatly affected the mobilization decision. The decision of the Russian leader to recruit approximately 300,000 Russian citizens into the army is seen as dysfunctional in terms of the lack of personnel in the administration part of the army. It is claimed that the military training of 300,000 Russian citizens to be recruited into the Russian army will be kept very short. It is quite remarkable that the Russian Defense Minister Shoigu announced that the next target will be 1 million after the supply of 300,000 people. All these decisions only led to the gradual abandonment of the local population in Russia. While citizens' flight from Russia continues at full speed, the next steps of the Kremlin administration and Russian